I took the job at Marisol Bay Community Clinic because my marriage was falling apart and I needed to be somewhere my wife wasn't, which is not the kind of thing you say in an interview, but is the kind of thing that determines where you end up. The clinic sat on a strip of fog-prone coastline about 40 minutes south of Eureka, California, wedged between a seafood processing plant and a laundromat that had been closed since before I arrived. The building itself was a former urgent care center that the county had converted into a behavioral health and medical intake facility in 2019, primarily to handle overflow from the two larger hospitals up the coast that were perpetually at capacity. We saw everything: migrant workers with industrial injuries, unhoused individuals in crisis, tourists who had driven off the road in the fog, local families without insurance, and, most relevant to what I need to describe, the occasional walk-in who arrived at the front desk with no referral, no ID, and no clear explanation for how they'd gotten there. I should say what I did. I was a night intake coordinator, which is a title that sounds more important than it is. In practical terms, I sat at the front desk or in intake room B from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. And my job was to be the first point of contact for anyone who came through the door during those hours. I took vitals, entered demographic information into the system, conducted a preliminary screening questionnaire, and triaged patients into one of 3 tracks: medical, behavioral, or hold for morning. If someone arrived in genuine medical distress, I paged the on-call physician, and if someone was in psychiatric crisis, I followed protocol for a 5150 hold and contacted the crisis team in Eureka. Most nights, though, I saw between 0 and 4 patients, and the majority of my shift was spent alone in a building that made sounds I never fully cataloged. The clinic had 6 rooms: intake A and B at the front, 2 exam rooms in the middle, a small lab, and a staff break room at the back. The hallway was L-shaped. Fluorescent lights, the kind that buzz at a frequency you stop hearing after 20 minutes, but your body never stops registering. Linoleum floors, beige walls, a smell that was some combination of antiseptic, old carpet adhesive, and the salt air that crept in through a vent in the break room that never sealed properly. At night, with the overhead panels dimmed to half because the full brightness gave everyone headaches, the building had a quality I can only describe as attentive. Not haunted, not menacing, just aware that it was occupied. I'd been working there for about 7 weeks when the night I need to tell you about began. It was a Thursday in mid-November. The fog had come in early, around 4 in the afternoon, according to the processing plant workers who mentioned it when one of them came in at 11 with a hand laceration. I treated the laceration. It was superficial enough that I could handle it without paging Dr. Correa. And by midnight, I was alone again. I remember the quiet that night being particularly specific. On most nights, there was some ambient sound from the road or from the processing plant's refrigeration units, or from the laundromat's exterior signage, which still had power and would occasionally click and hum despite the building being vacant. But that Thursday, the fog seemed to muffle everything into a single flat silence. The kind that makes you aware of your own breathing, your own circulation, the small wet sounds your mouth makes when you haven't spoken in a while. At 1:47 a.m., someone came through the front door. I know the exact time because I had just checked the clock on the intake computer. I'd been reading an article on my phone about custody mediation. This was during the period when Laura and I were still deciding whether to go through the courts or try to handle things ourselves. And I remember thinking I should stop reading because it was making my chest tight. Then the front door opened and I heard footsteps, and I set my phone face down on the desk. The front door had a pneumatic closer that made it take about 4 seconds to shut. During those 4 seconds, the fog came in. Not metaphorically. It actually entered the lobby as a visible presence, a low, milky layer that rolled across the floor before the doors sealed and the building's heating system began to dissolve it. I watched it dissipate around the shoes of the person who had just walked in. She was standing at the front counter. I say she because the person presented as female appeared to be somewhere between 30 and 50. I could not narrow it further, which was itself unusual, because estimating age is something you get good at in intake, and was wearing clothes that were appropriate for the weather, but carried no purse, no bag, no phone, no visible personal items of any kind. Gray jacket, dark pants, shoes that might have been navy or black. Hair that was either dark brown or black, cut to the shoulders, damp from the fog. She was looking at me. I said, "Good evening. Are you here for medical attention?" This is the standard greeting. It establishes purpose immediately and gives the patient a framework to respond within. Most people say yes, or describe a symptom, or say they were told to come here, or, if they're in crisis, say nothing coherent but display effect that tells me what I need to know. She said, "I think I need to be seen." Her voice was calm, measured, not flat. There was tonal variation, appropriate cadence. It sounded like a normal human voice. But something about the phrasing struck me. "I think I need to be seen" is not how people typically express it. People say, "I need to see a doctor," or "I'm not feeling well," or "someone told me to come in." The construction she used, "I think I need to be seen," carried an odd quality of self-assessment, as though she were reporting on herself from a slight distance. I pulled up the intake form on the computer. "Absolutely. Can I start with your name?" "Catherine." "Last name?" "Morrow." "Date of birth?" "March 9th, 1978. I typed this in. The responses were immediate. No hesitation, no searching. People often pause on their date of birth, not because they've forgotten it, but because the clinical context makes them briefly self-conscious, or they're in pain, or they're calculating whether to give real information. She delivered it like a timestamp. "And what brings you in tonight, Catherine?" She looked at me for a moment before answering. The look was not uncomfortable. It was not aggressive or vacant or confused. It was something I'm going to try to describe precisely because it became important later. She looked at me the way you look at a paragraph you're reading for the second time. With comprehension, but with attention to details you might have missed initially. It lasted about 2 seconds. "I've been having trouble with my reactions," she said. I typed this into the chief complaint field. "Can you tell me more about that? What kind of reactions?" "Physical ones. When things happen around me, my body responds. But the responses don't always match what's happening. I'll flinch before something falls. Or I won't flinch when I should. I'll cry during something that isn't sad, or I won't feel anything during something that should be overwhelming. It's been getting worse. I want to be clear that this is not, on its face, an unusual complaint. Emotional dysregulation, incongruent affect, exaggerated startle responses, blunted responses. These are all well documented in anxiety disorders, PTSD, depersonalization derealization disorder, and a range of neurological conditions. What she was describing sounded, at first pass, like something that could be sorted out with a behavioral health referral and possibly a neurology consult. I noted it and continued. "How long has this been going on?" "I'm not sure. I noticed it recently, but I think it may have been happening longer than I realized." "Are you currently taking any medications?" "No." "Any history of neurological conditions, seizures, head injuries, migraines?" "No." "Any psychiatric history? Depression, anxiety, trauma-related conditions? No. Are you currently in any distress? Pain, shortness of breath, dizziness? No. I feel fine right now. This was also unremarkable. People often feel fine in the moment they're describing symptoms that occur intermittently. I completed the demographics section. She gave an address in Trinidad, which is a small town about 15 miles north, and said she had no insurance, which I noted and told her we could help with. And then I moved to vitals. I'm going to take some basic measurements, if that's okay. Blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, the oxygen saturation. Okay. She sat in the intake chair across from my station. I rolled my stool over with a portable vitals cart. A Welch Allen Connex that the clinic had gotten secondhand from one of the Eureka hospitals. I wrapped the blood pressure cuff around her left arm. Her skin was cool, which was consistent with having just come in from the fog. I pressed the start button. Her blood pressure was 118/76. Heart rate 72. Temperature 97.8. SpO2 98%. All completely normal. Textbook, actually. The numbers were so clean they looked like the defaults you'd use in a training simulation. I logged them. Everything looks good, I said. I'm going to have you wait, and when Dr. Correa is available, she'll do a more thorough assessment. For now, I'd like to ask a few more screening questions, if that's all right. Of course. I opened the PHQ-9, which is a standard depression screening tool we administered to all behavioral health track patients. 9 questions, each scored 0 to 3. I read them to her. Over the past 2 weeks, how often have you been bothered by little interest or pleasure in doing things? Not at all. Feeling down, depressed, or hopeless? Not at all. Trouble falling or staying asleep, or sleeping too much? Not at all. She answered every question the same way. Not at all. 0 on every item. A perfect score meaning a total absence of depressive symptoms. This is possible, obviously. Healthy people score 0. But in the context of someone presenting at a clinic at 1:47 in the morning with complaints about incongruent physical and emotional responses, a flat 0 across all 9 items felt. And I want to choose this word carefully. Rehearsed. Not dishonest, not defensive. Rehearsed. Like she had studied what a healthy response pattern looked like and was executing it. There's a subtle difference between someone who genuinely experiences no depressive symptoms and someone who is performing the absence of depressive symptoms. And I could not, in that moment, point to any concrete evidence for why I felt I was seeing the latter. It was a clinical intuition, the kind you develop after enough hours of watching people answer questions about themselves. And I noted it privately, but did not write it down. I moved to the GAD-7, which screens for anxiety. Same result, 0 on every item. Then the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. All negative. Then the CAGEAID, for substance use, all negative. She answered every question promptly, with appropriate eye contact, in a voice that modulated naturally. Nothing was wrong with her answers. Everything was wrong with the shape of her answers, by which I mean that real people, even healthy ones, hesitate somewhere. They ask for clarification on one question. They say, maybe a little on one item before downgrading it to 0. They display micro-expressions of recognition or discomfort when a question accidentally touches something real. Catherine Morrow displayed none of these. She moved through the questionnaires the way a cursor moves through a form, field by field without friction. I finished the screening and told her she could wait in exam room 1. I walked her down the short hallway and opened the door. The The room had a standard exam table with paper covering, a rolling stool, a wall-mounted otoscope and ophthalmoscope, a small counter with a sink, and a poster about hand hygiene that had been there since the building was an urgent care center. The fluorescents in this room were slightly brighter than in the hallway, and when she stepped inside, I noticed something I hadn't registered in the dimmer intake area. She didn't blink when the light changed. This is a small thing. I want to be honest about how small it is. When you move from a dimmer space to a brighter one, most people blink or squint reflexively. The pupillary light reflex causes the pupils to constrict, and there's typically an accompanying blink, sometimes two. It happens automatically. She walked from the half-lit hallway into the fully lit exam room, and her eyes adjusted without any visible blink response. Her pupils may have constricted. I wasn't close enough to check. But her eyelids did not move. I told her the doctor would be in when available. She sat on the exam table. The paper crinkled. She said thank you. I pulled the door mostly closed, leaving it open about 2 inches per protocol for unaccompanied patients at night, and walked back to the intake desk. Dr. Correa was on call, but was sleeping in the break room, which was standard for nights when the patient volume didn't justify staying awake. Our protocol was to let her sleep unless a patient required immediate medical attention or had been waiting more than 45 minutes. I decided to let Catherine wait while I organized my notes and thought about what I'd observed. I pulled up her intake file and began typing my clinical impressions. I wrote, "Patient presents with chief complaint of incongruent physical and emotional reactions to stimuli. Denies psychiatric history, medication use, or substance use. Screening tools negative across all domains. Vitals within normal limits. Affect calm, cooperative, and appropriate. No observable signs of distress, impairment, or disorganization. Recommend medical evaluation to rule out neurological etiology, with behavioral health follow-up as indicated." Then I sat there for a moment and added a note in the free text section that I probably should not have written, but that felt necessary. Screening responses notable for uniformity. No variability observed across items or instruments. Clinical impression is of a patient who is performing wellness rather than exhibiting it. Recommend careful rapport building and re-administration of screening tools at follow-up to assess consistency. I saved the file and checked the time. 2:14 a.m. I decided to let Dr. Correa sleep until 2:30 and then wake her. During those 16 minutes, I did something I don't usually do during a shift. I sat at the intake desk and listened, not to anything specific. I listened to the building with Catherine Morrow in it versus the building without her, and I tried to determine whether anything had changed. This is going to sound irrational, and I want to acknowledge that. I was a night intake coordinator at a rural coastal clinic, not a paranormal investigator. I had a degree in health sciences and a certificate in phlebotomy and 3 years of clinical experience. Rust and I understood that my job was to screen patients and manage paperwork, not to sit in the dark monitoring the ambient quality of a building because a patient had answered a depression questionnaire too perfectly. I understood this. I sat and listened anyway. The building sounded the same. The fluorescents buzzed. The heating system cycled. The vent in the break room let in a thin whistle of sea air. Exam room 1 was 15 feet down the hallway and around the corner from my desk. And from that room, I heard nothing. Not silence, absence. The distinction matters. Silence is what you hear when nothing is making noise. Absence is what you hear when something that should be making noise isn't. A person sitting alone in an exam room makes noise. They shift on the paper. They breathe audibly in the quiet. They clear their throat or sniffle or adjust their clothing. From exam room 1, I heard the same quality of nothing that I heard from the empty rooms. At 2:30, I walked to the break room and woke Dr. Correa. Elena Correa was in her late 50s, a family medicine physician who had been with the clinic since it opened. She was sharp and efficient and had the particular no-nonsense warmth of someone who had practiced in underserved settings for decades. She sat up on the break room couch, put on her shoes, and asked what we had. Walk in at 1:47. Catherine Morrow, 47 years old, from Trinidad. Chief complaint is incongruent physical reactions. Flinching before events. Not flinching when appropriate. Emotional responses that don't match stimuli. Denies everything on screening. Vitals are clean. How clean? Perfect. 118/76, 72, 97.8, 98. Doctor, Correa looked at me. She'd been doing this long enough to hear what I was actually saying. How's her affect? Appropriate, cooperative, calm, almost too coherent for a 2 a.m. walk-in. Drugs? I don't think so. Pupils were normal. No tremor, no diaphoresis, no visible signs. K-Jade was negative, but you don't trust the screening. I don't trust the uniformity of it. She nodded and stood up. I'll go see her. Give me the chart. I handed her the tablet with Catherine's file and watched her walk down the hallway toward exam room 1. She turned the corner. I heard her knock twice, then open the door. I heard her say, "Catherine, I'm Dr. Correa. I understand you've been having some unusual reactions." Then I heard Catherine's voice, muffled by distance, but audible enough to make out the cadence. She was responding, and the conversation continued in the tones of a standard clinical encounter. Question, response, follow-up, response. Normal, professional, exactly what it should sound like. After about 12 minutes, Dr. Correa came back to the desk. She looked thoughtful but not alarmed. She's pleasant, Dr. Correa said. Articulate. Good eye contact. She described the symptoms clearly, says she's been noticing for a few weeks that her startle response is off. Her emotional reactions are delayed or mismatched. Sometimes she'll react to things that haven't happened yet. React to things that haven't happened yet? Her words. She said sometimes she flinches or braces before something actually occurs. She thinks she might be anticipating things subconsciously, but she's not sure. What do you think? Dr. Correa pulled up a stool and sat down. Neurologically, it's interesting. Could be a functional neurological disorder. Could be a seizure variant. Temporal lobe stuff can do strange things to emotional processing and time perception. Could be anxiety presenting in an unusual way, despite her denying it. Did you notice anything off about her? Off how? I hesitated. I don't know. The screening responses were unusually uniform. No variation at all across 4 instruments, and she... I stopped, because what I wanted to say was, she doesn't blink when the light changes, and she doesn't make noise when she's alone in a room. And I knew how that would sound. She what? She just felt very prepared, like she'd thought about what the right answers would be before she got here. Dr. Correa considered this. Some patients do that. The anxious ones especially. They rehearse the visit in advance because the visit itself is a source of anxiety. It's actually a feature, not a bug. If she's rehearsed, she might be more anxious than she's presenting. This was a perfectly reasonable interpretation, and I accepted it because it was 2:30 in the morning and I wanted to accept it. Dr. Correa told me she'd ordered some basic blood work, a CBC, metabolic panel, thyroid function, and that we should draw it before Catherine left. She said she'd refer her to neurology through the county system and schedule a follow-up at the clinic in 2 weeks. Standard of care, responsible, complete. I walked back to exam room 1 with the blood draw kit. I knocked, opened the door. Catherine was sitting on the exam table in the same position I'd left her. The paper beneath her was undisturbed, not shifted, not wrinkled, not rearranged. She was sitting on it in what appeared to be the exact posture and position she'd been in 30 minutes earlier. This is not impossible. People can sit still for 30 minutes. But people who sit still for 30 minutes on an exam table typically show some evidence of having been still. A settled quality, a slight slump, the particular look of someone who has been waiting. Catherine looked like she had just sat down. She looked freshly arranged. Dr. Correa ordered some blood work, I said. I'll just need to draw a few tubes. Do you have a preference for which arm? Either is fine. I set up the vacutainer system, tourniquet, alcohol swab, 21-gauge butterfly needle, 3 tubes, lavender top for the CBC, green for the metabolic panel, a gold for the thyroid. I pulled the rolling stool over and sat down. She extended her left arm. I applied the tourniquet above the elbow and palpated for a vein. Her veins were easy to find. Good caliber, good bounce, well positioned in the antecubital fossa. I swabbed the site, uncapped the needle, and told her she'd feel a small stick. I inserted the needle. The blood came immediately. Dark red, normal flow rate. I seated the first tube and watched it fill. Everything was normal. The blood looked like blood. It filled the tube at the expected rate. I switched to the second tube, then the third. I released the tourniquet, withdrew the needle, applied gauze and a bandage. The entire process took about 2 minutes. Routine, unremarkable, except for one thing. When I inserted the needle, she didn't react. And I don't mean she didn't flinch. Many people don't flinch if they're not needle phobic and if the phlebotomist is competent. I mean, there was no reaction of any kind. No micro tension in the forearm muscles. No slight intake of breath. No momentary tightening of the hand. No pupil dilation. No change in facial expression. No acknowledgement, even at the most involuntary physiological level, that a sharp piece of metal had just penetrated her skin. I have drawn blood from hundreds of people. I have drawn blood from patients who are unconscious, heavily medicated, in shock, and in diabetic comas. Every one of them, at some level of their nervous system, reacted to the needle. A twitch, a shift, a vascular response. Sometimes the vein itself will spasm or roll when the needle touches it. Something. The body has reflexes that operate below consciousness, below choice, below even awareness. They are not optional. They are not suppressible. They are the signature of a functioning peripheral nervous system responding to noxious stimuli. Catherine Morrow's body did not produce this signature. I taped the gauze, labeled the tubes, and told her she could go back to the waiting area or stay in the room, whichever she preferred. She said she'd wait up front. I walked her back to the lobby. She sat in one of the plastic chairs near the door. I returned to the intake desk, logged the blood draw, and put the tubes in the transport container for the morning lab courier. Then I sat there and thought about what I had just experienced. I should have documented it, but the absence of a pain response during venipuncture is clinically significant and should have been noted in her chart. It could suggest neuropathy, a spinal cord issue, a congenital insensitivity to pain condition, all of which would be relevant for the neurology referral Dr. Correa had ordered. But I didn't document it, and I've thought a lot about why. And the honest answer is that what I'd felt in that room wasn't clinical concern. It was something else. Something closer to the feeling you get when you're watching a video of a person and you suddenly realize it's AI generated. That split-second shift where all the features are correct but the integration is wrong, where the whole is less convincing than any individual part. I didn't document it because documenting it would have required me to frame it clinically, and the clinical framing didn't match what I'd perceived. What I'd perceived was that Catherine Morrow's body had not reacted to the needle because her body did not know it was supposed to. That's an insane thing to think. I knew it was insane when I thought it. I know it's insane now. I'm telling you anyway because it was the first thought I had, unedited, before my professional training kicked in and started generating reasonable alternatives. She sat in the waiting area for another 20 minutes while I processed the paperwork. During those 20 minutes, I watched her on the intake area's security monitor. The clinic had 4 cameras, one in the lobby, one in the hallway, one covering the parking lot, and one at the back entrance. The lobby camera gave me a clear overhead view of the waiting area. And I watched Catherine Morrow sit in that plastic chair for 20 minutes without moving. Not without moving much. Without moving. No postural adjustments, no crossing or uncrossing of legs, no reaching to scratch an itch. No checking a phone. She didn't have one. No looking around the room. No fidgeting with her hands. She sat with her hands in her lap and her gaze directed straight ahead, and she was as motionless as the chair she was sitting in. I watched this on the monitor for the full 20 minutes while I typed up discharge instructions and a referral form. Every time I glanced at the screen, I expected to catch her in some normal human behavior. Checking the clock, adjusting her jacket, looking toward the door. Every time, she was in the same position. The timestamp on the camera feed advanced. Catherine did not. At 3:20, I printed the discharge papers and brought them to her. When I approached, she turned her head to look at me, and the transition from stillness to movement was, I need to find the right word here, instantaneous. Not quick. Not sudden in the way that a startled person moves suddenly. Instantaneous, the way a paused video is instantaneous when you press play. There was no acceleration. She was still, and then she was moving, with no visible transition between the two states. Here are your discharge instructions, I said. Dr. Correa has put in a referral for neurology, and we'd like to see you back here in 2 weeks for a follow-up. The lab results should be back within a few days, and we'll call you if anything comes up. Thank you, she said. She took the papers. She stood up. She walked to the door. I watched her go, and the pneumatic closer let the door open, and the fog, still dense, still low, rolled in around her ankles again as she stepped out. I watched through the glass as she walked across the small parking lot, and then I watched her on the parking lot camera. She walked to the edge of the lot, where the asphalt met the gravel shoulder of the coast road. There was no car. She had not arrived in a vehicle. The parking lot camera had a limited range, and within a few seconds, she had walked beyond its field of view, heading north along the road into the fog on foot at 3:20 in the morning. I locked the front door. I went back to the intake desk. I pulled up the security footage and rewound the lobby camera to 1:47 a.m. when she had first arrived. I watched her enter. I watched the fog roll in. I watched her approach the counter, and I watched my own back as I turned to greet her. Everything matched my memory. I fast-forwarded through the intake process, the wait, the blood draw trip, the return to the lobby. Then I let the footage play at normal speed during the 20 minutes she'd sat in the waiting area. On the recording, she was exactly as still as I'd observed on the live feed. No movement at all for 20 minutes. But the recording showed me something the live feed hadn't. because the live feed had been a small window in the corner of my monitor that I was glancing at intermittently, while the recording was full screen and had my complete attention. At the 3:04 timestamp, about 16 minutes into her wait, something changed. I had to rewind and watch it 3 times to be sure I was seeing it. Her head, which had been facing directly forward, was now oriented about 15 degrees to the right, toward the hallway, toward the camera mounted at the junction of the hallway and the lobby. She had not turned her head. There was no motion on the footage. At 3:03:48, she was facing forward. At 3:04:02, she was facing the hallway camera. The frames in between showed no movement. It was as if 2 still images had been spliced together, but the timestamp was continuous, and the rest of the frame, the light levels, the slight wobble of the camera's auto-adjustment, showed no signs of editing or interruption. I was looking at a 14-second gap during which a human head had changed position by 15 degrees without any visible process of turning, and she was looking directly into the camera. Not in the general direction of the camera, into it, into the lens, with an expression I could not read because the resolution wasn't high enough to capture her features in detail at that distance, but with an orientation that was precise. She knew where the camera was. She was looking at it the way you look at a person you're aware of. Then, at 3:06:11, her head was facing forward again. Same phenomenon. No visible motion between positions. I closed the footage. I sat at the desk. The building hummed around me. I could hear the ocean, faintly, through the walls. Not waves, but the general low roar that the coast produces at night. A sound so constant, it functions as silence. I want to tell you what I did with this information. What I did was nothing. I finished my shift. I handed off to the morning coordinator, Darren, at 6 a.m., and I drove the 40 minutes home to the apartment I was renting in Arcata while Laura stayed in the house we'd shared in Sacramento. I slept. I woke up in the afternoon and ate and looked at my phone and did not call anyone about Catherine Morrow. In the professional framework I inhabited, what I had witnessed was either a camera glitch or a misperception born of fatigue and emotional stress. I was a man going through a divorce, working alone at night in a fog-bound clinic, and I had let a patient's unusually calm demeanor get under my skin. That was the story that made sense. I went back to work that night. Friday, nothing happened. Saturday, I was off. Sunday night, I worked again, and at approximately 11:15 p.m., Catherine Morrow walked through the front door. She was wearing different clothes, a dark green jacket instead of the gray one, lighter pants. But her hair was the same, her posture was the same, and her expression when she approached the counter was identical to the one she'd worn 4 nights earlier. Not similar, identical. The same angle of the head, the same degree of eye contact, the same distance from the counter. "I think I need to be seen," she said. The same words, the exact same words, with the same cadence, the same slight emphasis on seen. "Catherine," I said, "you were here Thursday night." "Yes." "Is this about the same issue? The reactions?" "It's gotten worse." "In what way?" "The timing is more off. I react to things before they happen. Not just a little before, much before. And I've stopped reacting to some things entirely. Things that should produce a response don't produce anything." I pulled up her file. Her lab results had come back Friday afternoon. I checked the notes from the day staff. CBC normal, metabolic panel normal, thyroid function normal. Everything was, once again, perfectly, completely, unremarkably normal. "Your lab work came back normal," I said. "All within range." "I know." I paused. "How do you know? We hadn't called you yet?" She looked at me with that same reading expression, that careful, second-pass attention. "I assumed," she said, "based on how I feel. It was a reasonable recovery, but it was a recovery." She had said, "I know with certainty," not "I figured." I noted this and moved on. "Let me take your vitals again, and we can have Dr. Correa take another look." I took her vitals. Blood pressure, 118/76. Heart rate, 72. Temperature, 97.8. SpO2, 98%. The same numbers. I stared at the screen. I have taken thousands of sets of vitals. Blood pressure alone is influenced by dozens of variables: hydration, sodium intake, caffeine, stress, time of day, ambient temperature, body position, how long the person has been sitting. Heart rate fluctuates with breathing, with posture, with the micro stresses of being in a clinical environment. Temperature varies by tenths of a degree based on circadian rhythm, physical activity, and hormonal fluctuations. Oxygen saturation shifts with altitude, respiratory effort, and peripheral circulation. The probability of all four measurements being identical across 2 visits 4 days apart is not 0, but it is vanishingly small. These are not static numbers. They are snapshots of a dynamic system. Getting the same snapshot twice is like shuffling a deck and dealing the same hand. I wrote down the numbers. I woke Dr. Correa. I told her Catherine was back and that her symptoms had progressed. I did not tell her about the vitals. I did not tell her about the camera footage. I am trying to understand why I didn't. And the closest I can come is this. I was afraid that saying it out loud would require me to hear what it sounded like. And I already knew what it would sound like. It would sound like a sleep-deprived man going through a divorce, projecting pattern onto noise. Dr. Correa saw Catherine for about 20 minutes. When she came back, she was more concerned than she'd been on Thursday. "She's describing anticipatory reactions," Dr. Correa said. "Responding to stimuli before the stimuli occur." I asked her for examples, and she gave me 3 very specific ones. She said she pulled her hand back from the stove before the burner ignited. She said she caught a glass before it fell off the counter. Not reached for it. Caught it while it was still on the counter before it started falling. And she said she turned to look at her front door a full minute before someone knocked. "Those could be coincidence," I said. "Or confabulation. Memory rewriting the sequence so it feels like anticipation when it was actually simultaneous." I know. But she doesn't describe them that way. She's very precise about the temporal gap. She says the reactions come first and the events come after. And she's certain of the order because she's been timing them. Timing them. She says she started watching the clock when she feels a reaction. She notes the time. Then she waits for the event. She says the gap is increasing. Used to be a few seconds. Now it's minutes. I felt something shift in the room. Not the room itself. The conversation. We had crossed from clinical evaluation into something else. And Dr. Correa felt it too. Because she sat down on the stool and took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes and said, "I'm going to refer her to psych. Neurology is still in the queue, but I want a psychiatric eval before that. This could be a delusional framework building around benign experiences. Do you think it is?" I think it's the most likely explanation. But she's very convincing, and she doesn't present as delusional. There's no paranoid ideation, no disorganization, no grandiosity. She's describing her experience with the precision of a scientist reporting data. "Did you notice anything unusual about her physically?" Dr. Correa put her glasses back on. "Like what?" "Like, did she react to the physical exam? When you did the neurocheck, reflexes, that sort of thing?" Reflexes were normal. 2+ throughout. Sensation intact. Coordination fine. She paused. Actually, no, I did notice one thing. When I tested her patellar reflex, the knee jerk, it was appropriate, but the timing was off. The reflex happened before the hammer hit. Not noticeably before, not to the naked eye. But I felt it in my hand. The leg moved, and then I felt the contact. It was like the reflex anticipated the stimulus. We looked at each other. "That's not possible," I said. "No. The patellar reflex is a monosynaptic arc. Stimulus, and receptor, spinal cord, motor neuron, response. It's the simplest reflex in the body. It can't anticipate." "I know what a monosynaptic arc is," Dr. Correa said, without irritation. "I'm telling you what I felt. It could be my own perception being off. I'm tired, it's 3 in the morning. But you asked, so I'm telling you." She discharged Catherine with an expedited psych referral and asked her to come back in 1 week instead of 2. Catherine said she would. She left the same way as before, walked to the edge of the parking lot, turned north, disappeared into the fog on foot. I did not watch the security footage that night. I made a deliberate decision not to. I went home and I slept, and I spent Monday doing laundry and talking to Laura on the phone about the mediator's schedule and trying to figure out how to divide a life into 2 lives. And I did not think about Catherine Morrow. That's a lie. I thought about her constantly. I thought about the vitals and the needle and the camera and the reflex and the way she had said, "I know," when I told her the lab results were normal. I thought about the phrase, "I think I need to be seen," and how it had sounded both times, and whether the emphasis on seen was about medical attention or about something else, about visibility, about being perceived, about confirming that she registered to other people's senses. I worked Tuesday night. The shift was quiet. 1 patient, a fisherman with a dislocated finger, in and out by midnight. I spent the rest of the night at the intake desk, and at about 2 a.m., for reasons I could not have defended professionally, I started going through the clinic's patient records. I searched for Catherine Morrow. Her file came up, the 2 visits, the lab results, the referrals. I checked the address she'd given, a street in Trinidad. I looked it up on my phone. The street existed. The house number she'd provided did not. The street went up to 415. She had given 523. I searched for the name in the broader county health system, which our clinic had partial access to for referral coordination. No Catherine Morrow? No one with that date of birth at any address in Humboldt County. I checked the state's Medi-Cal database, which we could query for eligibility purposes. No match. None of this was definitive. Uninsured patients gave wrong addresses frequently, sometimes out of embarrassment, sometimes out of fear, sometimes because they were unhoused and made something up. It wasn't unusual for a patient to not exist in any database. It was unusual for a patient to not exist in any database while presenting with the composure, articulation, and apparent stability that Catherine displayed. Patients without records are typically patients in crisis, transient, disorganized, struggling. Catherine was the least crisis-presenting patient I had ever processed. I should have told someone. I should have flagged the address discrepancy with the day staff and noted it in her file. I didn't. Instead, I did something else. Something that I haven't been able to fully justify to myself, and that I am going to describe honestly. And I pulled the security footage from her second visit and watched all of it. I started from her entrance at 11:15 p.m. and watched through her departure at approximately 3:40 a.m. The footage confirmed what I had already observed in person. She was still during periods of waiting. not unusually still in any single frame. You could look at any individual moment and see a person sitting in a chair, but cumulatively still in a way that no person is. Over 20 minutes of waiting room footage, I counted her total distinct movements. She blinked 11 times. Her chest rose and fell with breathing, although the rate appeared lower than what I had observed during our in-person interaction. She shifted her weight once, at the 14-minute mark. That was all. 11 blinks, 1 weight shift, continuous low-rate breathing, no over 20 minutes. For comparison, I pulled random waiting room footage from a week earlier. A patient waiting for a prescription, a college-age man who seemed relaxed and comfortable. In 20 minutes, he shifted position 31 times. He checked his phone 12 times. He blinked approximately 300 times, based on my estimate from a sample minute extrapolated across the full period. He yawned twice, scratched his arm once, crossed and uncrossed his legs 4 times, and looked around the room repeatedly. This is normal. This is what a human body does when it is alive and conscious and waiting. I did not count Catherine's breathing rate from the footage, because the resolution wasn't sufficient to determine individual breaths reliably. But I did notice one other thing. At 2:58 a.m., while Dr. Correa was examining her in exam room 1 and the waiting room was empty, the lobby camera was recording an empty room. I was at the intake desk, out of frame. The hallway camera showed the closed door of exam room 1. Nothing was happening. Then, on the lobby camera, I heard something. The clinic's cameras recorded audio, though the quality was poor. A built-in microphone that mostly captured ambient noise and nearby conversation. The lobby camera's audio at 2:58 a.m. captured the hum of the fluorescents, the faint cycling of the HVAC system, and then, for approximately 4 seconds, a sound. I listened to it 5 times. It was faint. It was rhythmic. It lasted exactly 4 seconds and then stopped. It did not repeat. It sounded like breathing. Not the breathing of a person in the room, but breathing that came through the microphone as though someone were standing directly next to the camera, which was mounted 8 feet up on the wall in the corner of the lobby. Standing next to the camera would have required a ladder. There was no one in the room. 4 seconds of close, measured breathing, and then nothing. I closed the footage. I went home. I didn't sleep well. Wednesday, I was off. Thursday, I worked, and this time, I did something I'm not proud of. At the beginning of my shift, I adjusted the lobby camera. Our cameras were fixed-position dome units, but they had a digital zoom function accessible through the monitoring software. I zoomed the lobby camera in slightly and adjusted the angle so that if Catherine sat in the same chair, her face would be visible at higher resolution. I told myself this was standard clinical documentation. It wasn't. It was surveillance. I was watching a patient because I was frightened of her, and I was dressed the fear up in language that made it sound like diligence. She came in at 2:07 a.m. Same entrance, same fog, same approach to the counter, same words. I think I need to be seen. This time, I was ready. Catherine, welcome back. Can you tell me what's changed since Sunday? The gap is longer between the reaction and the event. How long? Today, I woke up crying. I cried for about 10 minutes. Then nothing happened. I went about my day normally. Then, at around 6 in the evening, I received a phone call from someone telling me that a woman I knew had died. I'm sorry to hear that. I didn't know her well. She was a neighbor. We'd spoken maybe 4 times. But my body had already processed the grief before I received the information. By the time the phone rang, I felt nothing. That must be confusing. It isn't confusing. It would be better if it were confusing. It's very clear. The reaction comes first. The cause comes later. There's no confusion about the sequence. The sequence is just wrong. I took her vitals. I want to tell you they were different this time. I want to tell you that the numbers had finally shifted, even slightly, because a shift would have meant she was a biological system operating within normal variation, which would have meant she was what she appeared to be. But the numbers were the same. 118 over 76, 72, 97.8, 98%. The exact same four numbers for the third consecutive visit. I wrote them down. My hand was steady. I want you to know that. I was not shaking. I was not panicking. I was sitting in a well-lit clinic doing my job and writing down vital signs, and my hand was steady because when you work nights in a healthcare setting, you develop the ability to continue functioning regardless of what you're feeling. And what I was feeling was a very quiet, very rational form of terror. I woke Dr. Correa. She saw Catherine. She was in with her for a long time, almost 40 minutes. When she came back, she sat down at the desk and didn't speak for about 30 seconds. "I tested something," she said. I didn't tell her I was going to do it. During the exam, while I was checking her pupils with the pen light, I deliberately dropped my reflex hammer off the counter behind me. It's a loud, sharp sound. Metal on linoleum. Startling. And she flinched. Appropriate startle response. But she flinched 2 seconds before the hammer hit the floor. I didn't say anything. I was watching her face when I let go of the hammer. Her pupils dilated and her shoulders contracted while the hammer was still in the air. Before the sound, before the impact, and then when it hit, nothing. No reaction at all, like it had already happened for her. I know what it is. I don't know what to call it, but I know what it is. The reflex is functional. The timing is inverted. She reacts to the stimulus before the stimulus occurs, and then the stimulus itself produces nothing because the reaction has already been spent. Could it be? No. I ran the same test twice more, varying the interval. I knocked a pen off the counter without warning. She caught her breath half a second before it fell. I clapped my hands suddenly. She blinked before my palms made contact. The gap varied, sometimes a half second, sometimes nearly 2 seconds. But the sequence was always the same. Response, then stimulus. Every time. Dr. Correa was not a woman given to alarm. She had practiced in war zones, in refugee camps, in places where the human body did things that textbooks didn't cover. She was alarmed now. Not visibly, her voice was controlled, her posture was professional. But I had worked with her for almost 2 months, and I could hear the edge in her breathing. "I'm going to escalate the neurology referral to urgent and add a neuropsych evaluation," she said. "And I want an EEG. I don't know what this is, but it's real. It's not psychosomatic and it's not delusional. I tested it. It's reproducible." She discharged Catherine and asked her to come back in 3 days. Catherine said she would. She left the same way, on foot, northward, into fog. After she was gone, I checked the footage on the zoomed lobby camera. The higher resolution showed me what the standard view hadn't. During her wait this time, about 25 minutes while Dr. Correa examined her, Catherine had been in the lobby alone. The zoomed frame showed her from the shoulders up, well lit, in focus. She was sitting still, as before. The blink rate was low. The breathing was slow. Everything was consistent with my prior observations. But at the 12-minute mark, the footage showed something I had to watch several times to be certain of. Her face changed, not her expression. Her face. The underlying geometry shifted. And it was subtle. The kind of thing you could dismiss as a compression artifact or a shadow from the flickering fluorescence. But I watched it frame by frame, advancing manually. And what I saw was this. Over a span of approximately 3 seconds, the proportions of her features adjusted. The distance between her eyes decreased by what might have been a millimeter. Her jawline softened almost imperceptibly. The bridge of her nose narrowed. It was as if her face were a draft being revised. The changes were toward something more symmetrical, more averaged, more precisely centered on what a human face should look like. She was becoming more normal. And more normal is not a direction that real faces move in. Real faces have asymmetries. They have features that are slightly too large or too small or too far apart. They have character. What I was watching on that screen was character being removed. The change lasted 3 seconds and then stopped. And she was still again. And her face looked exactly like it had always looked. Which was the problem. Because now I understood that how it had always looked was a product of these adjustments, these tiny corrections happening continuously below the threshold of real-time perception, visible only when the footage was advanced frame by frame. I closed the software. I sat at the desk. The building hummed. The ocean murmured through the walls. The fog pressed against the windows, like something trying to be let in. Here's what I did not do. I did not report this to anyone. I did not flag it for the day staff. I did not mention it to Dr. Correa. I did not call the police or the county health department or anyone who might have had authority to investigate a patient who did not exist at the address she had provided, whose vital signs did not vary, whose reflexes preceded their stimuli, whose face restructured itself when she thought she was alone. Here is what I did. I went home, and I lay in bed. And I thought about something Catherine had said during her first visit. She had said, "I think I need to be seen." And I had interpreted seen as examined. But there was another meaning, wasn't there? A more literal one. She needed to be seen. She needed to be perceived. She needed someone to look at her, to measure her, to take her vitals and draw her blood and watch her on a camera and confirm that she registered as a person to another person's senses. And I had done that. On 3 times now. I had looked at her with professional attention and personal fascination, and I had confirmed her again and again, and she kept coming back. The next shift I worked was Sunday. She came in at 1:33 a.m. Same words at the counter, same everything. But this time, when I took her vitals, I did something different. After the automated reading, 118 over 76, 72, 97.8, 98, identical, always identical. I took her blood pressure manually. Old-fashioned sphygmomanometer and stethoscope. I wanted to hear it myself. I wanted my own ears between her and the numbers. I inflated the cuff. I placed the stethoscope over the brachial artery. I released the valve slowly and listened for the Korotkoff sounds. The rhythmic tapping that indicates systolic pressure. The disappearance of sound that indicates diastolic. I heard them, and they were present. They were real sounds produced by blood moving through an artery under pressure. Systolic, 118. Diastolic, 76. The numbers were the same. But the sounds, this is difficult to articulate. The sounds were correct. They were perfectly correct. They were textbook perfect Korotkoff sounds, exactly as they are described in training materials, without any of the individual variation that real sounds have. When you take enough blood pressures manually, you learn that every person's Korotkoff sounds are slightly different. Some are louder, some have a musical quality, some are crisp, and some are muffled by tissue. Catherine's were none of these. They were the platonic ideal of Korotkoff sounds. They were what Korotkoff sounds would sound like if they were generated from a description rather than produced by a body. And I removed the stethoscope. She was watching me. "You took it manually this time," she said. "I like to double-check." "You've double-checked because the numbers are the same every time." I didn't respond. "I know they are," she said. "I can feel them being the same. I can feel the number 72. It's not a heart rate. It's a setting." "Catherine, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with that information. That's part of why I keep coming here. Because I don't know what the appropriate reaction to this is, and I can't generate the appropriate reaction because my reactions don't follow what's happening. They follow what's going to happen, and I don't know what's going to happen." "Are you saying your vital signs are?" "I'm saying I can feel them being maintained. The way you feel someone holding your arm. Something is holding these numbers. Something is keeping them there. And I came here because I needed someone to measure them. Because maybe if someone measured them, they would become real. They would become mine, instead of just numbers that are being performed for whatever is reading them." I sat very still. "Performed for whatever is reading them," I repeated. "I don't know what's watching me. But something is. Something that expects certain numbers. I can feel the expectation. My body meets it. My blood pressure meets it. My temperature meets it. My face meets it. I can feel my face being held in place, like a hand under my chin, keeping my features where they're supposed to be. And the only time I feel like I'm real is when someone else measures me. Because the measurement introduces a second observer, and for a moment the numbers have to satisfy both the thing that's watching and the person who's reading the screen. And in that moment, there's a conflict. And in the conflict, I can feel myself. You can feel yourself? In the gap between what it expects and what you see, that's where I am. I'm in the discrepancy. Dr. Correa did not examine Catherine that night. I did not wake her. Instead, I sat with Catherine Morrow in intake room B for 2 hours and 14 minutes. And she told me things that I am going to recount to you as precisely as I can. She said that approximately 3 months ago, she had begun to notice that her physical reactions to events were occurring before the events themselves. She said this had started small, catching objects before they fell, on flinching before loud sounds, and had escalated to the point where she would experience full emotional responses hours before the precipitating events. She said she had initially attributed this to anxiety or hypervigilance. She said that 6 weeks ago, she had stopped attributing it to anything natural. She said that 6 weeks ago, she had been standing in her kitchen, wherever her kitchen was, since the address she'd given was fictional, and had felt, suddenly and completely, a sensation she could only describe as being read. Not watched, not observed. Read, like a document being scanned, like her body was being checked against a set of parameters, and wherever a parameter was not being met, a correction was applied. She said the corrections were physical. Her heart rate was adjusted. Her blood pressure was set, as her temperature was stabilized. Her face was arranged. She said she could feel these adjustments happening the way you can feel someone adjusting your collar. The touch is on the outside. It's not yours. But it's so close to your skin that you can't separate it from yourself. She said the reactions, the anticipatory flinching, the preemptive grief, the temporal inversion of cause and effect, were a side effect of the corrections. She said her body was being calibrated to respond to events that hadn't occurred yet, because whatever was calibrating her operated on a different timeline. It was setting her reactions in advance, the way you'd program a thermostat. The event was the temperature change. The reaction was the heating system engaging. But the heating system was engaging before the temperature changed, because the system was predictive rather than responsive. She said she had come to the clinic because the clinic had instruments, and instruments introduced a second frame of reference. And in the space between the two frames, the one imposed by whatever was reading her and the one recorded by the blood pressure cuff, the thermometer, the pulse oximeter, she could feel something like autonomy. She said my measurements were the only thing that made her feel real, because they created a moment of negotiation between what she was supposed to be and what she was. She said she was afraid that the corrections were getting more precise, that whatever was reading her was learning from the measurements I was taking and using them to improve its calibration, that each visit was making the performance more accurate, more seamless, more difficult to detect. She said she was afraid that by asking me to look at her, she was teaching the thing that controlled her how to be more convincing. She said she was afraid that the reason she kept coming back was not her own choice. I listened to all of this. I listened the way you listen to someone describing symptoms, with attention, without judgment, with the part of my clinical training that says, take the patient's experience seriously, even when the framework they use to describe it doesn't map onto known pathology. I listened, and I took notes, and I asked clarifying questions, and at 5:47 a.m., she stopped talking, and I printed discharge papers, and she left. She walked north, into the fog, on foot. I did not tell Dr. Correa about the conversation, and I told her that Catherine had come in again with the same complaints, and that I'd spent time taking a more detailed history. Dr. Correa said the neurology referral was still pending, and the neuropsych evaluation was scheduled for the following week. I nodded and went home. That afternoon, I called the neurology clinic in Eureka to check on the referral. They had no record of a Catherine Morrow. I called the neuropsych office. Same. I called the county mental health intake line. Same. The referrals Dr. Correa had submitted. I'd watched her submit them. I'd seen the confirmation screens had not arrived. I logged into the clinic's electronic health record system and pulled up Catherine's chart. The referral orders were there. The confirmation numbers were there. Everything on our end was documented and complete. But when I clicked the referral tracking link that should have shown the receiving facility's acknowledgement, the link went to a blank page. Not an error page, a blank page, white, empty. The URL was valid, the connection was active, but there was nothing at the destination. I tried to call the number Catherine had provided as a contact. The number rang once, connected, and I heard 4 seconds of breathing. Close, measured, rhythmic. The same 4 seconds I'd heard on the lobby camera audio. Then silence. Then a dial tone. I hung up. I sat in my apartment in Arcata, and I looked at the wall, and I thought about what was happening. And for the first time, I allowed myself to organize my observations without filtering them through clinical plausibility. A woman had been coming to my clinic whose vital signs did not vary, whose pain reflexes did not fire, whose startled responses preceded their stimuli, whose face restructured itself on camera, whose address did not exist, whose referrals vanished in transit, whose phone number connected to 4 seconds of breathing and then nothing, who described herself as being read, calibrated, and performed by something she could not identify, who said my measurements were the only thing that made her real, and who kept coming back. I worked Tuesday night. She came in at 12:52 a.m. I was waiting for her. I had not adjusted the camera. I had not prepared any tests. I had decided, during the 36 hours since her last visit, that I was going to do something I had never done with a patient before. I was going to be direct. She approached the counter. She opened her mouth. "Don't say it," I said. She closed her mouth. "Don't say, 'I think I need to be seen.' I've heard it 4 times now. You say it every time, word for word. You say it because it's what you're supposed to say when you arrive here. The way your blood pressure is what it's supposed to be when I measure it. But I need you to say something different. I need you to say something that isn't part of the pattern." She stood at the counter and looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something move across her face that wasn't composed. It was brief. It was not an expression I could name. It was more like the face attempting an expression it hadn't been calibrated to produce. A flicker of asymmetry. A half-second where her features were genuinely, humanly unbalanced. Where one side of her mouth pulled differently than the other, and her left eye narrowed slightly more than her right. And she looked, for that fraction of a moment, like a specific person rather than a general one. "I don't know what else to say," she said. "I only know how to come here." "Then tell me something real. Tell me where you actually live. Tell me your real name. Tell me something that isn't a form field." I don't know if I have those things. Everyone has a name. Everyone who started with one. What if I started with the form? What if the name is the most real part of me, not because it's mine, but because it's the part that was filled in first? I came around the counter. I stood in front of her. We were about 3 feet apart, in the lobby, under the fluorescents, on camera. I looked at her face. Up close, in real time, at full attention, her face looked normal. It looked like a woman's face. It had pores and faint lines, and the slight discoloration of a mole near her left ear, and the barely visible dry skin around her nostrils that you get from cold air. It was detailed. It was thorough. It was a face that had been gotten right. "What are you?" I asked. "I don't know." "Are you a person?" "I don't know. I think I'm something that is being made to resemble a person. I think the resemblance is getting better each time. And I think you're part of how it's getting better, because every time you measure me, whatever is building me gets more data about what a person is supposed to look like, from the inside. The vitals, the blood work, the reflexes. You've been teaching it the specifications. And the reactions. The temporal inversion. That's where the resemblance fails. That's the error in the process. Whatever is constructing my responses is working from a model that doesn't process time the way you do. It knows what I should feel. It doesn't always know when. The sequencing is approximate. And it's getting more approximate, not less. Because the thing that's building me is working faster than it used to. It's running ahead of the events. It's completing my reactions before the world gives me reasons for them. Why are you telling me this? Because you asked me to say something that isn't part of the pattern. This is the only thing I have that isn't part of the pattern. The awareness of the pattern. The thing that builds me doesn't know I can see it. When I told you I can feel my face being held in place, it doesn't know I feel that. The corrections are supposed to be invisible. They're supposed to be seamless. They're not. I can feel every one of them, and the feeling is the only part of me that I'm sure is mine. I stood there in the lobby at 1 a.m, 3 feet from a woman who was telling me she was a construction, a maintained projection, an ongoing act of fabrication by something that did not understand human chronology, and I believed her. Not because the evidence was sufficient, not because her explanation was coherent. I believed her because of the way she had looked when I told her not to say the words. That half-second of genuine asymmetry, of one side of her face pulling against the other, of something unscripted and unsmoothed, fighting its way to the surface. That was real. Whatever she was, that moment was real. "What happens if you stop coming here?" I asked. "I don't know. I think the measurements are part of the process now. I think whatever is building me uses the clinical data as a reference standard. If I stop coming, it loses the reference. Maybe the construction degrades. Maybe I degrade. Maybe that's better. Or maybe you just stop being real. I'm not sure I am real. I'm sure I'm here. Those might not be the same thing." She left that night without seeing Dr. Correa. I did not take her vitals. I did not draw blood. I did not administer any screening tools. I sat at the intake desk after she was gone, and I stared at the empty waiting room, and I made a decision. I deleted the zoomed camera setting and returned it to its default position. I closed Catherine Morrow's chart. I did not write a note about the visit. As far as the clinic's electronic health record was concerned, she had not come in that night. I did this because she had told me that every measurement I took was being used to improve the construction. Every data point I entered was training material. The vitals, the blood work, the reflex tests, the screening questionnaires, all of it was being consumed by whatever process was assembling Catherine Morrow into a more convincing approximation of a person. I was not treating a patient. I was refining a product. And the product was sitting in my waiting room, increasingly seamless, increasingly real, increasingly desperate to tell me that the refinement was not in her interest. If I stopped measuring her, the process would lose its reference point. That was the theory. That was what she had suggested. I did not know if it was true. But I knew that continuing to collect data on a patient whose data was anomalous in ways I could not explain and would not report was not clinical care. It was participation. Thursday night, she came in at 1:15 a.m. I was at the desk. The fog was heavy. The door opened. She approached the counter. She didn't say anything. She stood there and looked at me, and I looked at her. "I'm not going to take your vitals tonight," I said. She nodded slowly. "I'm not going to run any tests. I'm not going to screen you. I'm not going to enter anything into the computer." "I understand. Do you still need to be here?" She thought about this, not the practiced, immediate response she'd given to every clinical question. An actual pause, a real consideration, a human duration of uncertainty. 6 seconds. "I don't know," she said. "I know how to come here. I know how to arrive and speak and sit and wait and answer. I know how to be a patient. I don't know how to be anything else. If you don't measure me, I don't know what I'm doing here." "Then maybe you should stop coming." "Maybe." She stood at the counter for another moment. The fluorescents buzzed. The vent in the break room whistled. The ocean breathed against the building's exterior. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Am I frightening you?" I thought about this honestly. "No. You were, initially. Now I think I'm frightened of what's happening to you, or through you. But you, specifically standing here, no. You're not frightening. That's part of the problem, isn't it? I should be frightening. What I've described to you should be terrifying. A woman who isn't sure she's human, who feels her face being held in shape, who reacts to things before they happen. That should produce fear. But it doesn't. Because the thing that's building me has gotten very good at calibrating the response I produce in other people. You're not afraid because I've been optimized to not produce fear. That's part of the specification, That's part of what your measurements have been teaching it. I didn't have an answer for that. She was right, or she might have been right. Or her being right was indistinguishable from her saying something convincing enough to function as truth. I didn't know anymore. The categories I used to sort experience, real, unreal, clinical, personal, threatening, benign, had become unreliable. And I could not determine whether they had become unreliable because Catherine Morrow had destabilized them or because they had always been unreliable, and she was simply the first phenomenon honest enough to say so. "Goodbye," she said. It was the first time she had ever said goodbye. Every other visit, she had simply left when the paperwork was handed to her, walking away without a closing word. This was different. This was a departure rather than a cessation. She walked to the door. The fog came in. She stepped out. She walked across the parking lot and reached the edge of the asphalt and turned north and disappeared. I did not follow her on the camera. I did not pull up the footage. I sat at the desk and I waited for my shift to end. And I went home and I slept. She did not come back on Sunday. She did not come back on Tuesday. She did not come back on Thursday. A week passed. 2 weeks. The neurology referral remained in the system, pointing to a blank page. The psychiatric evaluation appointment passed without anyone showing up. Dr. Correa asked me once if Catherine had come in again, and I said no, and she said, and moved on. The clinic continued. Patients came and went. Fishermen, plant workers, tourists, locals. Normal people with normal complaints and vital signs that varied from visit to visit the way vital signs are supposed to vary. I continued working nights. Laura and I finalized the mediation terms, and I started the process of actually rebuilding a life in Arcata rather than just surviving in it. I signed a lease on a better apartment, one with a view of the bay. I adopted a cat from the shelter in Eureka, which I mentioned because the cat is relevant. The cat's name was Miso. Gray and white, about 2 years old, affectionate in the way that shelter cats often are. Grateful, attentive, physically insistent on proximity. Miso would sit on my lap when I read, sleep on my chest at night, follow me from room to room with the particular devotion of an animal that has been alone and does not want to be alone again. About 5 weeks after Catherine's last visit, I came home from a shift at 6 in the morning and Miso was sitting on the kitchen counter, which was normal. But he was sitting very still, which was not. He was facing the living room. He was staring at a fixed point in the space between the couch and the window. His ears were forward. His body was rigid. He was not tracking movement. His eyes were locked on a single location, the way a cat locks on prey, except there was nothing there. I looked at where he was looking. The living room was empty. Morning light was coming through the window. The space between the couch and the window held nothing but air and carpet and the particular quality of early coastal light that turns everything silver. "Hey," I said to Miso. He didn't look at me. I crossed the kitchen and touched his back. He didn't react to the touch. Then, about 2 seconds later, he flinched, a sharp, full-body startle, the kind a cat produces when surprised by a loud sound. But there had been no sound. The apartment was quiet. The flinch came 2 seconds after my touch, and it did not correspond to the touch. It corresponded to nothing I could identify. It was a reaction without a stimulus, produced after a delay, as by an animal staring at a fixed point in an empty room. I picked him up and held him. He relaxed immediately and began purring. Normal cat, normal warmth, normal vibration against my chest. I carried him to the bedroom and closed the door and put him on the bed, and he curled up and slept. I did not sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed And I watched my cat, and I listened to him purr, and I tried to determine whether the rhythm of his purring was the same rhythm it had always been, and I could not remember. I could not remember what his purring had sounded like before, and the inability to remember felt less like a failure of my memory and more like a substitution. Like the current rhythm was being written over the previous one, updated, revised, corrected. I told myself this was paranoia. I told myself that a cat flinching oddly after being touched was well within the range of normal feline behavior. I told myself that I was a man under stress who had spent several weeks having unusual encounters with an unusual patient, and that the experience had primed me to see patterns in noise. All of these things were reasonable. All of them were the things a rational person would tell himself. I told them to myself clearly and firmly, and they sounded exactly the way they were supposed to sound. That was the problem. They sounded right because they were calibrated to sound right. The reassurance arrived before the anxiety, pre-positioned, already formatted, like a response that had been placed in my mind slightly ahead of the need for it. I don't know when I started noticing my own reactions. I don't know if it began that morning or if it had been happening for weeks, and I had only now accumulated enough awareness to perceive it. But once I noticed, I could not stop noticing. I would reach for a coffee cup and feel my hand adjust. Not to the cup's weight, which I hadn't lifted yet, but to a weight that was already known, already accounted for, already factored into the grip strength before contact. I would walk down a hallway and feel my stride make a micro-correction for a threshold that was still 3 steps away. I would begin to form an emotional response to a conversation and feel the response arrive, completed, whole, pre-assembled, before the words that were supposed to trigger it had been spoken. I would take a patient's blood pressure and hear the Korotkov sounds and recognize them. Not as the sounds of that patient's particular cardiovascular system, but as sounds I had heard before, exactly, identically, from a woman who no longer came to the clinic. I went to see my own doctor. I described the symptoms in clinical terms: anticipatory reactions, temporal distortion of stimulus response sequences, sensation of externally imposed physiological regulation. She listened carefully and referred me to neurology, which I found darkly appropriate. My referral, unlike Catherine's, arrived at its destination intact. I had an appointment for a month later. I have not yet gone. That's not because I'm afraid of what they'll find. It's because I'm afraid of what they won't. Because the thing Catherine described, the sensation of being read, of being checked against a set of parameters, of having corrections applied continuously and invisibly, I can feel it now. Not metaphorically, physically. The feeling is exactly as she described it. A hand adjusting your collar. A pressure that is on the outside but so close to you that you cannot separate it from yourself. It is with me when I wake up and when I fall asleep and when I sit at the intake desk at 2 a.m. in a fog-bound clinic on the Northern California coast. My vitals, the last time I checked them, and I check them now, every shift, compulsively, the way a person checks a lock, were 122 over 78, 68, 98.2, 99%. Normal, varied, human, different from the last time I checked, but not by much. And the variation is getting smaller. I still work nights at Marisol Bay Community Clinic. I still sit at the intake desk. I still watch the front door for the pneumatic hiss and the low roll of fog across the linoleum. Catherine Morrow has not returned. Her file is still in the system. Her referrals still point to blank pages. The 4 seconds of breathing are still on the lobby camera audio from that November night, and I have not deleted them. because they are the only proof I have that any of this happened. And because, on the nights when the fog is heavy and the building is quiet and I am alone, I can hear the same breathing without playing the recording. Close, measured, rhythmic, coming from everywhere, coming from me. I think I need to be seen.